The night felt cold, far colder than it should have been for the middle of October. The cabin was small, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road or any signs of civilization. I had rented the place for the weekend to escape the stress of city life. A few days alone in nature sounds peaceful, right? The kind of peace that's almost unsettling. I had arrived late in the afternoon. The last stretch of the road was narrow, winding through dense trees that blocked the sunlight, turning everything a dim, muted shade of gray. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It was old, probably built decades ago, with a slanted roof and weathered wood that seemed to groan with every gust of wind. This porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I wasn't expecting luxury, just a place to relax. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something felt off. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as I moved through the small living area. The place smelled old, like mildew and forgotten memories. A small fireplace dominated one wall, and a set of mismatched furniture filled the rest of the space. There were no curtains on the windows, just empty glass panes, which seemed odd for a cabin this isolated. The bare light bulbs hanging from the ceiling flickered when I turned them on, and the single bathroom had a sink that dripped incessantly, making the silence even more unbearable. I shrugged it off, thinking I'd just gotten too used to city life and needed to adjust to the stillness of the woods. I unpacked my bag, set up a small fire, and made dinner. A simple meal I cooked over the open flame. The sun sank behind the trees as I ate, casting long shadows over the cabin. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves in the trees. The fire crackled, and I thought about the quiet nights I'd spent camping in places like this before. It should have felt like a return to normal, but something about it didn't sit right. The silence outside wasn't peaceful. It felt too empty. I sat in front of the fire for a while, listening to the wind and watching the flames dance. Then, out of nowhere, a thud came from somewhere outside, sharp and loud enough that it made me jump in my seat. My heart raced for a second as I froze, staring into the shadows outside the cabin. Nothing. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the trees shifting, maybe a branch falling or an animal moving through the underbrush. I had read a lot about the sounds the woods could make, so I chalked it up to that. But then came another thud, louder this time, closer, almost like something or someone was walking around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The wind didn't help. It howled and rattled the windows, but through that, I thought I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stood up and moved cautiously to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing. No movement, no shapes, nothing. I decided to check the locks on the doors, just in case. Even though I told myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. The locks were old, rusty, but secure enough. I checked the windows too, making sure they were all latched tight. Satisfied for the moment, I sat down again by the fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The night wore on. I tried to relax, but every little creak of the cabin made me tense. Each gust of wind felt like it was pushing against the walls, and every whisper of the trees outside seemed like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. Eventually, I decided to turn in, needing to get some sleep to make it through another day of quiet in the woods. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined I heard the footsteps again, slow and purposeful, moving around the cabin. Each time, I would shoot upright, heart pounding, only to find the room dark and still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting eerie shadows against the walls. But nothing was there. Hours passed. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke, the sun was already up, casting a grayish light through the cabin's bare windows. I felt groggy, as if I hadn't slept at all. The air inside the cabin felt colder, even though the fire had died down long before I'd gone to sleep. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I pulled on my jacket and stepped outside. The world around me was still, but it wasn't a peaceful stillness. It was an oppressive one. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the forest was holding its breath. I walked to the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground around the cabin was covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves. But there, right in front of the cabin's porch, the leaves were disturbed. It looked as though something had been dragged across the ground, leaving deep, uneven impressions in the earth. The marks led off into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I froze. Could have been an animal, but these weren't the kind of tracks I'd expect from any wild creature around here. They looked too deliberate. Without thinking, I followed the tracks. My feet moved almost on their own, and I soon found myself deep in the woods, the trees closing in around me. The tracks led to a small patch of dirt, but that's not what made me stop in my tracks. What stopped me was the sound, something like scraping, coming from the far side of the clearing. I wasn't sure whether to move closer or turn back, but I had to know. Slowly, I stepped forward, my feet barely making a sound on the damp earth. I reached the edge of the clearing, where the trees were thickest. Then I saw it. A pile of branches and leaves had been stacked in a makeshift shelter, and next to it, a large wooden crate sat half buried in the dirt. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The crate was old, and it had been there for a while, the wood rotting from years of exposure. But what bothered me the most was what I found inside. A collection of discarded objects, old blankets, a few cans of food, and a flashlight that looked like it had been used recently. Everything was covered in dirt and moss, as if someone had been living here. I stepped back, a chill crawling up my spine. Someone had been here, and recently. I didn't wait around to figure out who. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my breath coming in short bursts as I stumbled through the trees. My mind raced. What had I gotten myself into? Who was out here with me? When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, heart still pounding. I locked the door, checking the windows again just to be sure. The footsteps, the strange marks in the ground, the shelter in the woods. It all made sense now. Someone had been watching me. Someone was out there. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But how could they get here in time? I was miles from the nearest town. I had to leave, I knew that much. I couldn't stay here another night. But as the day dragged on, and the sun began to set again, I realized something. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. The tracks outside the cabin weren't the only thing I had missed the first time I walked around. I now saw more marks in the ground, different shapes, different angles leading around the cabin. And the footsteps, they had started again. I was no longer alone. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, nothing more. Just a few days away from the grind of the city, a break from work, a chance to recharge. I had rented a cabin in the woods for myself and my best friend, Charlie. We'd always talked about getting away for a weekend, just to experience nature, some peace and quiet, and maybe a little fishing. I was 28 at the time, just at that stage where I had started to get tired of the city's noise. Charlie, a few years older, had been the one to encourage the trip. He'd grown up in the country and loved the idea of getting away from it all. We found this cabin on one of those websites where people rent out vacation homes. The listing had a few pictures. A simple log cabin, some trees around it, a calm river nearby. The owner's description mentioned how peaceful it was and how you could really unwind from the stresses of everyday life. Charlie had called ahead to ask a few questions, and the owner, a gruff but friendly older man named Bill, assured him that everything was in good shape. There was no phone service, no internet, and no Wi-Fi, but we'd known that going in. We were looking to disconnect. The trip took us about 3 hours to drive to the cabin from the nearest town. The last stretch of road was dirt and narrow, surrounded by thick woods. It was mid-October, and the air was cool with that crisp edge that made your breath visible. The leaves had started to change, painting the forest with hues of orange, yellow, and red. Everything felt so peaceful, almost like a different world from the one we left behind. It was hard to believe how quickly everything could change. When we arrived, the cabin was just as the pictures had shown, maybe even a bit better. It sat on a small hill with a view of a stream running through the woods. The area around it was quiet, nothing but the wind and the occasional bird call filling the air. The cabin itself was modest. One room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a loft with 2 beds. The place had an older, lived-in feel, but it was clean and cozy. The only thing that stood out was a large, sturdy door that led to a basement. It wasn't locked, but it seemed odd that it was even there in a place like this. We unpacked, and after a few hours of setting up and making ourselves at home, we decided to head out for a walk through the woods, just to get a feel for the area. It felt good to be away from the constant noise of the city. The woods were thick, and the path wasn't clearly marked, but we didn't mind. We walked along for what felt like hours, following the sound of the stream in the distance and talking about nothing in particular. It was one of those moments when you just felt free, untethered. As we were walking back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the edge of the woods, near the tree line. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could tell it wasn't someone we knew. It wasn't even someone who looked like they were walking toward the cabin. I pointed it out to Charlie, but by the time he looked, it was gone. "That's weird," he said, but we shrugged it off. It was probably just someone hiking or maybe a hunter. It wasn't all that unusual to see people out in these woods, but it felt strange to see someone standing still like that. I made a mental note to mention it to Bill when we saw him next. Later that evening, after a simple dinner of canned soup and some snacks, we settled in by the fire. The cabin had a wood stove, and the heat it gave off was enough to take the chill out of the air. We had a couple of beers, played cards, and listened to the crackle of the fire. It was nice. Too nice, in fact. We were both so relaxed that we didn't think much of the weirdness from earlier in the day. It was around 10:30 p.m. when we first heard it. A knock, soft, almost muffled, but still noticeable, came from the door that led to the basement. At first, we both stared at it, wondering if we had imagined it. But no, there was no mistake. It came again, a little louder this time, like someone was tapping against the wood. Charlie stood up first, his hand on his flashlight. I followed him as he walked slowly toward the door. "You sure you didn't leave something down there?" he asked. I shook my head. "I haven't even looked down there." We stared at the door for a moment. The knock came again, a little harder this time, and we both jumped. "Who's there?" Charlie called out, but no answer came. We waited, but the silence stretched on. After a moment of hesitation, Charlie reached for the door. "I'm going to check it out," he said. "Stay here." I protested, but he was already down the steps. I listened closely as he went down the creaky stairs into the basement, the silence pressing in on me. After a few minutes, I heard a thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor. My heart skipped a beat, but before I could move, Charlie was back upstairs, looking pale. "There's nothing down there," he said, his voice tight. "Just old stuff. Some boxes, shelves, nothing that could have made that noise." We were both quiet for a moment, trying to make sense of what just happened. But nothing did, so we decided to just go to bed. We locked the door behind us, double-checked the windows, and settled in for the night. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, with the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, little sounds, scratching at the walls, creaking in the floorboards, and that persistent tapping sound, faint but still there. I told myself it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But the longer I lay there, the harder it became to ignore it. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a cold chill in the room. The fire had gone out, leaving only the pale glow of the moonlight to illuminate the space. I sat up and shivered, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened earlier. Was it just the wind? A branch hitting the cabin? I didn't know. But then I heard it again, a loud, sharp bang. This time it came from above, from the loft. I stood up in an instant, my heart pounding in my chest. Charlie was already sitting up, wide-eyed. We both stared at the loft, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. It was quiet again. Too quiet. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the hairs on my neck standing up. We decided to leave. Right then, we couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my backpack, throwing it over my shoulder, and we rushed out of the cabin, both of us not looking back. The woods were dark, but the moonlight filtered through the trees just enough to light the way. We didn't know what was happening or why, but we knew we had to leave. When we finally reached the car, I started the engine and we drove as fast as the dirt road would allow, not looking back at the cabin. We didn't stop until we reached the town, and even then we stayed in the car for a while trying to calm down. Eventually, we got out, checked into a motel, and spent the rest of the night talking in low voices, still trying to process what had happened. In the morning, we drove back to the cabin to get our things. It was still there, sitting alone in the woods, just as we had left it. But the door to the basement was wide open, swinging in the breeze. Bill never really gave us an explanation when we spoke to him. He just seemed confused and told us the cabin was perfectly safe, that nothing had ever happened like that before. But we never went back. Not once. We learned to trust our instincts. Some places just aren't meant to be, and some nights are better left in the dark. It was the fall of 2023, and I was looking for a break. Proper one. No work, no phone calls, no distractions. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and the kind of silence that could make you lose track of time. I had always loved the idea of getting away, so when a friend of a friend offered me their secluded cabin up in the mountains of northern Colorado, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, tucked away on a small, winding road that was barely a road at all. Just a dirt path that slithered through a thick forest of evergreens. I didn't have high expectations. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just peace and quiet. It seemed like the perfect spot. The cabin itself was simple, old even, but in good condition. It had been built by the friend's family decades ago, and from the outside, it looked just like something out of a postcard. Wooden beams, a stone chimney, and a small porch that overlooked a dense stretch of trees. The kind of place you'd imagine settling into with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun slowly rise. I unloaded my gear quickly, eager to get the place ready for my stay. The inside of the cabin was just as simple as the outside: old furniture, a small kitchen, a wood stove in the corner for heat, and a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed covered in thick, worn blankets. The kind of blankets you'd find in a place like this. The walls were lined with bookshelves that were filled with old novels and knickknacks. There was even an antique rifle hanging above the mantel. It all had that rustic, lived-in feel, like it had been untouched for years, but in a comforting way. The perfect kind of quiet retreat. I set up my things and decided to explore the area a bit before nightfall. The forest around the cabin was thick, the trees so close together in some places that it almost felt like the woods were alive, wrapping themselves around the cabin. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. I took a walk along a small trail that led off behind the cabin, feeling the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. There was no one around for miles. It was just me and nature. That night, after eating a simple dinner, I settled into the cabin with a good book. The wind outside howled, pushing against the walls of the cabin as the storm that had been predicted rolled in. The fire in the wood stove crackled, and the cabin felt snug and safe, a welcome contrast to the wild weather outside. As the evening wore on, the wind grew stronger, and rain began to lash against the windows. Around midnight, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a soft thud. It was faint at first, like something heavy had dropped to the ground outside, but the sound repeated, slightly louder each time. At first, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or the shifting of the trees. But it was rhythmic, too consistent to be random. I lay still for a moment, listening. The wind had died down, but the thudding continued, this time closer. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the trail I had walked earlier. It was odd, but not alarming, at least not yet. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight, which seemed absurd in that moment, as if a tiny beam of light would make any difference in the vast, dark forest surrounding the cabin. The storm outside had picked up again, so the air was thick with the sound of rain. I stepped outside and shone the beam of light around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Nothing. The forest around me seemed unnaturally still, and the darkness felt heavier than usual. I moved toward the back of the cabin, where the thudding had been coming from. The flashlight flickered for a moment, and when it came back on, I thought I saw something, just for a split second, moving between the trees. A deer? A bear? I wasn't sure, but I wasn't going to find out. I turned to head back inside, but then I heard the sound again. A loud, unmistakable thud. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The forest was dead silent now, not even a rustle in the trees. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I convinced myself that it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other creature, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I rushed back inside, locked the door behind me, and went back to the couch. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me, but I forced myself to settle in. The rain was picking up again, and the wind howled louder than before. I tried to sleep, but every creak and groan of the cabin set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard the thudding again, but this time it was unmistakable. It was right outside the window. I jumped to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and rushed to the window. There was nothing, just the dark, rain-soaked forest. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was racing, imagining all kinds of possible explanations. None of them good. I debated calling someone, but there was no cell service up here, and I wasn't even sure who to call. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and it felt like something or someone was out there, just beyond the trees, watching. The thudding stopped after a while, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the thing from outside creeping closer to the cabin. I knew I wouldn't get any rest, so I decided to spend the rest of the night reading, trying to distract myself from the unease gnawing at my stomach. By morning, the storm had passed, but the cabin still felt unnervingly quiet. I forced myself to go outside and get some fresh air. The woods looked different in daylight, less menacing somehow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to take a walk down the trail again, hoping the daylight would calm my nerves. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of what could have made the thudding sounds. But there was nothing, just the usual forest animals and the rustle of the wind in the trees. I stopped for a moment, catching my breath, when I noticed something strange on the ground. It was a small pile of broken branches, arranged carefully, as if they had been placed there intentionally. It was an odd sight, considering how dense the forest was. No one had been out here, at least not recently. I bent down to examine the branches, and that's when I saw it. A boot print in the soft earth, just beside the pile of broken branches. It was fresh. Someone had been out here. Someone had been walking around my cabin. The realization hit me like a cold slap to the face. My heart was racing again as I retraced my steps back to the cabin. I had to get out of here. I wasn't alone. When I got back to the cabin, I started packing my things. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. But as I packed, I kept hearing something from outside, scratching noises at the back of the cabin, followed by more thudding. Then it stopped. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my gear and locked the door behind me. My car was parked at the base of the small hill leading up to the cabin, and I practically ran to it, my eyes darting nervously around the woods as I went. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I wasn't taking any chances. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. By then, my heart had finally slowed down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Looking back now, I don't know what it was, whether it was someone who had been out there for reasons I'll never know or something else entirely. But one thing's for sure, I won't be going back to that cabin. The woods have a way of hiding things, and whatever was out there, I don't want to find out what it was. Some mysteries, I suppose, are better left unsolved. The woods were quiet that evening. the kind of quiet you only find deep in nature, far from the buzz of city lights and the constant hum of technology. I hadn't planned to stay at the cabin for long, just a quick weekend getaway to clear my head. But there was something about that place, something unsettling in the way the trees seemed to loom over the small structure. The cabin wasn't much, just a rustic one-room building with an old stone chimney and a weathered porch. But for some reason, I felt an odd sense of isolation the moment I stepped inside. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, driving up a winding dirt road through the mountains, the kind that's barely wide enough for one vehicle. The kind of place where you get the feeling that not many people pass through. The road was lined with thick pines, their tall trunks almost closing in on me, casting long, eerie shadows over the ground. By the time I parked the car and unloaded my things, it was already dusk, and I quickly realized that I hadn't planned ahead for how to get firewood. The thought of walking into the woods to gather some on my own was daunting. Everything seemed so still, so unnaturally still. I decided it wasn't worth it, that I could make do without a fire for the night. The cabin had a small wood stove in the corner, and I figured I'd be fine with just the heat from that. I'd also packed some snacks and a few cans of soup, so I wasn't too worried about food. Inside, the place smelled like old wood and dust. The floorboards creaked as I moved around, and I could hear the wind rustling through the trees outside. I set my bag down on the small bed in the corner, which was covered in an old quilt that looked like it had been there for decades. The furniture was minimal: an old rocking chair by the stove, a rickety wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a few shelves lined with books, most of which were faded and unreadable. I opened one of the windows to let in some fresh air, hoping the chill of the evening would help clear the musty smell. As I stood there, staring out at the darkening woods, I had the odd feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. No loud noises, no strange movements, but it was as if the woods themselves were watching me. I shook off the feeling and went about making my dinner, opening a can of soup and heating it on the stove. The rhythmic sound of the can opener and the low simmer of the soup filled the quiet room. I tried to distract myself with a book I'd brought along, but my mind kept drifting back to the woods outside. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap or the rustle of leaves, and I'd glance up, half expecting someone to be standing at the window, staring in. But of course, there was no one, just the trees. The wind picked up, and the cabin creaked in response, a low groan as the wood expanded and contracted. I finished my meal and washed the few dishes I had used. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, the only sound in the room other than the occasional pop of the stove. I didn't feel like going to bed yet, but I was already getting the sense that sleep wouldn't come easily. The night had settled in fully, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy of trees outside. I sat in the rocking chair by the stove, staring into the flames, trying to focus on the warmth and the flickering light. But even then, it felt like something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, something I couldn't explain, something pressing down on me. My eyes kept darting to the windows, where the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. The kind of darkness where you could swear something was moving just out of sight. Eventually, the pressure in my chest became too much, and I decided I needed to get some sleep. I made my way to the bed, pulling the quilt over me, though it didn't feel like it would offer much warmth. The air in the room had grown colder as the night deepened, and I wrapped myself tighter, trying to ignore the chill. I stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination. It had been a long drive, and I hadn't had much time to rest the past few days. Maybe I was just tired, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear a sound from outside, a rustling of leaves, a crack of a twig. It sounded so close, too close, like someone or something was just outside the cabin, moving silently through the underbrush. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. There was nothing, just the wind and the occasional snap of wood. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off, but my sleep was fitful, filled with strange, fragmented dreams. I dreamed of walking through the woods, but the trees were different. They were thicker, darker, and the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. I felt like I was being chased, but whenever I turned to look, There was no one there, just the shadows, stretching longer and longer until they seemed to swallow me whole. I woke up with a start, heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the stove, which was slowly dying out. I looked around the room, trying to steady my breath, but the feeling of unease had only deepened. I glanced at the window, but the trees outside were so dark that I could barely make out their shapes. It was as if the night had swallowed the world whole. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the longer I lay there, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. I could feel it now, an undeniable sense of dread. It wasn't just the isolation. It wasn't just the silence. There was something else, something that I couldn't put into words. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it again, the sound of something moving just outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. It sounded too heavy to be an animal, too purposeful to be the wind. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight from the table and quietly crept toward the door. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but part of me needed to see it for myself. I slowly turned the handle and cracked the door open just a fraction, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. The woods were empty. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I could barely see anything beyond the porch, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness like a knife. I closed the door, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. The silence, the creeping sense of being surrounded by something unseen, it was driving me to the edge. It wasn't until the next morning, when the sun began to rise, that I realized just how much I had been affected. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and looked around the cabin. There were no signs of anyone being there. No footprints, no broken branches, just the usual wilderness around me. But as I stood there, looking at the forest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Across the clearing, near the edge of the trees, there was a large, jagged rock. And on that rock, there were marks, deep scratches, as though something had scraped its claws against it. The marks were fresh, too fresh. I didn't stay long after that. I packed up my things, locked the cabin door, and drove back down the winding road. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. But when I reached the main road, I looked back, and the cabin was just a tiny speck in the distance, disappearing behind the trees. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a weekend to unwind, disconnect from the constant noise of daily life, and just enjoy the stillness of the mountains. I had rented a cabin in the woods, somewhere in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, not too far from Asheville, North Carolina. The year was 2023, and I had just turned 32. The idea was simple: a break from the city, a few days of solitude, and a chance to do some hiking, read, and clear my head. I had been to the mountains before, but never alone. My friends had always come along on previous trips, and while I enjoyed their company, there was something about being by myself in the wilderness that intrigued me. Maybe it was the challenge of being alone, or perhaps it was the need to prove something to myself. Either way, I was ready for a few days of quiet. The cabin was small but cozy, tucked away in a secluded spot near a bubbling creek. The first thing I noticed as I pulled up the gravel driveway was the silence. It was the kind of silence that settles over everything, a deep, almost suffocating quiet. There was no highway noise, no sounds of distant machinery, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood and pine, the kind of earthy scent that makes you feel like you're truly out in nature. The place was equipped with everything I needed: a small kitchen with an old stove and refrigerator, a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom with a large bed covered in a quilt. The windows were big, offering an expansive view of the forest, the mountains rising in the distance. It was perfect. After unpacking, I spent the first couple of hours just settling in. I stoked the fireplace and made myself a cup of tea. I didn't have a clear plan for the weekend, just the vague intention to explore, get some fresh air, and clear my mind. The surrounding woods seemed inviting, with trails that I knew would lead to all kinds of new discoveries. So I decided to head out for a short hike that afternoon. As I wandered along the trail that bordered the creek, I felt a growing sense of peace. The air was crisp and fresh, and the forest was alive with movement. A squirrel darted across the path, and a rustle in the trees signaled the movement of something bigger, perhaps a deer. The peacefulness was comforting, and I could feel the tension of the city slipping away with every step I took. When I returned to the cabin a few hours later, I made dinner, lit a few candles, and settled in for the night. The sound of the creek outside was a constant, soothing presence, and the fire crackled in the hearth. I didn't bother with the television or even a book, just the quiet, the fire, and the peace of being alone in the wilderness. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. At first, it was just a faint unease, a sense that I wasn't quite alone. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't a noise. There was no tapping at the window or scraping against the walls. It was something more subtle. Maybe it was the silence, the way the stillness of the night seemed to press in on me, or maybe it was the isolation. But as I sat there in front of the fire, I started to feel like I was being watched. I stood up, walking over to the window to look outside. The night was pitch black, the forest nothing more than a mass of shadows. The wind had picked up slightly, but there was nothing unusual. I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to a combination of being in a new place and the fact that it was getting late. I made myself another cup of tea and went to bed. That night, I didn't sleep well. I tossed and turned, waking up repeatedly, each time feeling like there was something in the darkness just beyond my sight. I kept hearing faint creaks and rustling sounds, but every time I'd get up to check, there was nothing. By morning, I was exhausted, but I decided to get up early and go for another hike. The fresh air would clear my head. I made a quick breakfast, grabbed my jacket, and set out into the woods. The daylight helped, and I started to feel better, more grounded, but the nagging feeling that something wasn't right never quite left. It felt like I was being followed, even though I couldn't see or hear anything that would suggest it. I hiked for several hours that day, getting further into the forest than I had originally planned. The landscape was beautiful, with streams and small waterfalls cutting through the woods. I found a spot to sit by the water and just enjoy the solitude. But as I rested there, I noticed something strange. A series of footprints in the soft earth caught my attention. They were fresh, too fresh, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I had seen. They were human-sized, but the shape of the prints was uneven, as though the person walking had been in a hurry or was stumbling. I stood up slowly, scanning the area around me. There was no sign of anyone, but the footprints seemed to lead deeper into the woods. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe my decision to come here alone had been a mistake. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they quickly disappeared as they veered off the main trail. I stood still for a few moments, listening, but all I could hear was the wind in the trees. Reluctantly, I decided to head back to the cabin. When I returned, I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. It was still early, but something told me I wasn't safe out here alone anymore. I made myself some lunch and decided to stay inside for the rest of the day. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. I kept catching glimpses of movement outside, or hearing faint noises that made me question if I was truly alone. By evening, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there, just beyond the edge of the cabin's property. I spent the night staring at the shadows in the corners of the room, the sounds of the forest no longer soothing but unsettling. The next day, I woke up to a heavy fog blanketing the woods, the kind of fog that made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. I grabbed my backpack, gathered my essentials, and made the decision to leave. I didn't care about the rental fee for the cabin. I just needed to get out of there. As I was loading my things into the car, I glanced up at the cabin. That's when I saw it. On the front porch, there was a small object, a piece of cloth. It was a dark color, possibly navy blue, and it was torn. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it wasn't something I had left behind. Panic set in. My mind raced with questions. Was someone watching me? Had they been inside the cabin? I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been out there was still nearby. I got into the car and started the engine, looking back at the cabin one last time. The fog was thickening, and I couldn't see much, but I swear I saw a figure standing in the woods, just beyond the tree line. I didn't wait to confirm it. I drove away, not stopping until I reached the main road. As I made my way back to the city, I couldn't help but reflect on the past few days. The fear I felt was something I'd never experienced before. An unsettling, primal fear that something was out there, watching me. But as I pulled into the driveway of my apartment and turned off the car, I realized something important. The fear was gone. The strange feeling that had plagued me in the cabin had lifted. I was safe. I don't know who or what was out there or why they chose to stay hidden, but I made a vow never to go back to that cabin. I would never again let myself be so isolated, so vulnerable. The mountains, the silence, the woods, they were beautiful, yes, but they were also unforgiving, and sometimes the things that are most beautiful can also be the most dangerous. As I unpacked my things, I found that piece of torn cloth in my bag. I didn't remember picking it up, but it was there, in the pocket of my jacket. Maybe it was a clue. Maybe it was just a reminder to trust my instincts. Either way, it was the last thing I needed to see to know I was never going back. I was safe now. The weekend was over, and I could finally breathe again. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. I needed a break from the constant noise of city life, the constant buzz of my phone, the clamor of the traffic outside my window, the people. It was all starting to wear on me. So when I found a small, remote cabin listed for rent in the Adirondacks, I jumped on it. No one around for miles. Just me, the trees, and a lake to unwind beside. Simple, peaceful, or so I thought. The drive up was longer than I anticipated, but the scenery was beautiful. Thick forests, rolling hills, and the occasional stretch of clear blue sky. I had packed my things in the back of my old Subaru: a tent, some fishing gear, a couple of books, and, of course, the essentials. The closer I got to the cabin, the quieter the world seemed. No radio stations out here, and even my phone had no signal. It wasn't until I passed the last small town and turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin that I realized just how isolated I was. The cabin itself was small, a rustic wooden structure nestled between towering pine trees. The owners had left a note for me on the front door, a simple welcome and instructions for the key. It was exactly what I needed. No fuss, no distractions, just nature. Inside, the cabin was cozy. A stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchenette, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a lofted bedroom that overlooked the lake. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the smell of wood and earth filled the air. I unpacked my things and made myself at home, taking my time to get comfortable. The weather was perfect, chilly enough to need a sweater, but with clear skies. I could already feel the weight of the city lifting off my shoulders. I spent the first evening by the lake. The water was still, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. The air smelled fresh, and for a moment, everything felt right. I had no agenda, no one to answer to, just the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the distance. It was everything I had hoped for. The next morning, I decided to head out for a hike. I'd seen a trail map in the cabin, one that led deeper into the woods, around a bend, and up to a small peak that promised stunning views of the surrounding area. I packed a lunch, strapped on my boots, and made my way toward the trailhead. The trail was easy at first, a well-worn path through dense underbrush. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I could hear the distant call of birds and the rustle of animals moving through the brush. It was exactly what I wanted: peace and quiet, broken only by the sounds of nature. But as I walked deeper into the woods, things began to feel different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly, but something about the way the trees were spaced, the way the shadows stretched across the ground, it felt unnatural. The trail started to narrow, and I had to pay more attention to where I stepped. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds seemed to stop singing, and even the wind fell silent. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. I paused for a moment, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I was being watched. The thought seemed absurd. There was no one out here, I knew that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The woods were eerily still, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if they were being swallowed up by the trees. I pushed the thought aside and continued walking. The trail dipped down into a small valley, and then began to climb again. I was halfway up a steep incline when I noticed something strange. Footprints. Fresh ones. The soil was soft, and the impressions were clear. They were large, heavy prints, likely from boots. The strange thing was they were heading in the opposite direction, toward the trail I had just come from. I stared at the footprints for a while, trying to make sense of them. It wasn't that they were odd in shape, but they seemed out of place. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail before, and there was no way anyone could have passed me without me hearing them. I wasn't exactly alone on this trail. I had seen a few other hikers earlier in the morning, but they had all been much farther ahead of me. I took a deep breath and decided to keep moving. There was no reason to panic, I told myself. It was probably just another hiker who had turned around. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The silence pressed down on me like a heavy weight. By the time I reached the peak, the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky. The view was magnificent, but something about the air felt thick, heavy. I was on edge now, my mind racing. I felt like I needed to leave. I didn't belong here anymore. That's when I heard it. A sound from behind me. Footsteps, light but deliberate. I turned around, half expecting to see someone coming up the trail, but there was no one. Just the woods. Empty. I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had taken over my body. Every part of me was telling me to leave, but I stood there frozen, staring into the trees, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps stopped, and so did the rest of the sounds. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I started to back away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was still. After what felt like hours, I turned and ran back down the trail, not daring to look back. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and drew the curtains. I had never been one to let fear control me, but something about today had shaken me. The silence of the woods, the strange footprints, the sense of being followed. It was all too much. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside sent me into a fit of anxiety. I stayed up, staring out the window, convinced someone was out there, watching me. I thought I saw a figure moving in the trees once, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the dark, empty woods. The next morning, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to clean up or tidy the cabin. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I started my car and pulled away from the cabin, I couldn't help but look back. The place seemed so serene from a distance. The cabin nestled peacefully among the trees. But I knew better. There was something off about that place. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to understand. I didn't come back to the Adirondacks after that. I never even wanted to look at a cabin again. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever had followed me, whatever had made the silence feel so suffocating, I didn't want to know. I never found out who had been on that trail or why I felt so watched. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had been walking through those woods. And I never will. The cabin was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the stress of work, a chance to unwind. It was supposed to be peaceful. I needed to escape the chaos, the constant noise, the demands of life. I thought the quiet of the woods would be soothing. The nearest town, Ashford, was an hour away from the cabin, a quiet little place with a gas station and a few scattered houses. It was May 18th, 2025. My name is Jacob Lawson, and I was 29 at the time, single, with a lot of stress building up at work. I had just broken up with my girlfriend, and I needed some space to think. I rented the cabin online. Cheap, secluded, and right on the edge of a dense forest, about 5 miles from the nearest road. The owner, a middle-aged man named Paul, had sent me a simple message: "Key is under the mat. Make sure to lock up when you leave." It sounded simple enough. I packed up my things: a few bags of clothes, some snacks, and a couple of books to keep me entertained. I made the drive out to the cabin, passing through Ashford and taking the narrow, winding road that led deeper into the woods. It was a perfect spring day. The sun was shining, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. A small, 2-story place made of weathered wood with a stone chimney and a front porch that overlooked a small creek. It was isolated, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch for miles. I could already feel the weight of the world lifting from my shoulders. There was something calming about being so far removed from everything. I carried my things inside, put the key under the mat, and locked the door behind me. The interior was simple but cozy. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, a couple of chairs, and a small wooden table. Upstairs, there was a loft with a bed and a window that gave a perfect view of the surrounding trees. I tossed my bags on the bed and went to unpack. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a quick meal, read for a bit, and then sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of trees outside. I slept well, waking up only once or twice to the sound of animals outside. Deer, probably, or maybe raccoons. But it was the second night that things began to feel off. It started with a strange noise. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I was in bed, the cabin dark except for the soft glow of the moonlight coming through the window. There was a rustling sound coming from outside, something faint, just beyond the trees. I had assumed it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a deer, but then it happened again. And this time it was louder, almost like footsteps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the noise kept coming. The sound of movement, heavier than an animal, like something walking, deliberately, slowly. My heart began to race. I got out of bed and went to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass. The moonlight cast long shadows on the ground, but there was nothing out there, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was probably just a bear or some other animal. They often moved around the area at night, looking for food. But still, the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I tried to go back to sleep, but every little noise outside seemed to make me jump. A crack of a twig breaking, a rustle of leaves, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving through the brush. I kept listening, but I couldn't make out what it was. The house felt eerily still, too still. Then, just after midnight, there was a loud bang. Came from outside. I shot up from the bed, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and quietly made my way downstairs. My breath felt shallow. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards under my feet felt deafening in the silence. I stood by the window, the flashlight in hand, but I didn't dare to shine it outside just yet. The sound had come from the other side of the cabin, by the creek. It could have been anything, a fallen branch or something hitting the side of the house. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but my gut told me otherwise. I debated calling the police, but there was no cell service here. The landline didn't work either. It had been disconnected. I was completely alone, cut off from any help if something went wrong. I couldn't just sit there and wait. The noise had unsettled me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed a jacket, slipped on my shoes, and cautiously stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth. The light from the cabin cast a pale glow across the yard, but everything seemed calm. No movement, no signs of anything being disturbed. I hesitated for a moment, But then I walked to the edge of the property, where the land sloped down toward the creek. The sound of the water running over rocks was the only thing I could hear, aside from the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Then I saw it, something dark and out of place against the pale grass. There, near the creek, was a large shape, a black, heavy tarp or something like it. It was thrown over a pile of something. I couldn't make out the details from where I was standing, but my instincts screamed that I shouldn't go any closer. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I walked toward it slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. The shape under the tarp wasn't just some pile of discarded trash. It was too large, too structured. My breath hitched as I reached the edge of the pile, finally seeing what lay beneath the tarp. It was a barrel, the kind used to store large amounts of something, and it was partially open. My stomach twisted, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I was about to turn away, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a footprint, a large, muddy footprint, just inches from the barrel. A footprint that didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was too big, too deep, and the mud around it was disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged through it. I didn't know what to do. Panic started to set in. I wanted to run back to the cabin, lock the door, and pretend like nothing had happened, but the image of that barrel haunted me. I couldn't leave until I understood what was going on. I bent down and cautiously moved the tarp a little further. My heart was racing now, and my mind was spinning with worst-case scenarios. What if someone had been here? What if they were watching me right now? I peered inside the barrel. It was empty, but there was something else, something far worse. The barrel had a strange, metallic smell to it, a smell that made my stomach churn. I quickly pulled away, breathing heavily, feeling lightheaded. There was no way I was staying another night here. The sense of being watched had become overwhelming, and I couldn't ignore the dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I grabbed my things and rushed back into the cabin, locked the door, and turned all the lights on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I packed everything up as quickly as I could and left the cabin, making the long drive back to Ashford. I didn't look back. I never found out what was in the barrel or who had been lurking around my cabin that night, but I didn't need to know. I left the keys with the owner, told him I wasn't coming back, and got on with my life. That weekend was supposed to be a getaway, but it turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. I don't know if the person, whoever they were, was just trying to scare me or if they meant to do something far worse. But the one thing I do know is that I'll never go back to that cabin. It might have been peaceful at first, but whatever happened out there, whatever I felt, is something I can't shake. And that feeling of being watched stayed with me. Even now, years later, when I think about that cabin, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched once again. It was the first weekend of October when I decided to get away. The stress had been piling up. Work, life, everything. And I just needed some time to clear my head. So I booked a small, isolated cabin in the woods, the kind of place where cell service was spotty at best, and the closest neighbor was miles away. It felt like the perfect escape, a place where I could sit with my thoughts and enjoy some peace. I was 32, a city worker who had never really experienced the kind of solitude the cabin promised. The woods were something I had always admired from a distance but never really immersed myself in. I drove up on Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that made the breath come out in little puffs of white smoke. The leaves had already begun to turn, painting the landscape in shades of amber, gold, and red. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my car to fit between the trees on either side. I remember how quiet it was, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under my tires. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just my nerves acting up. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, small, wooden, and tucked away in a secluded area of the forest. The kind of place you would expect to find in a hiking brochure, perfect for a weekend getaway. It had a front porch with a couple of chairs, a fire pit in the backyard, and a single-story interior with a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a cozy living area. A wood stove sat in the corner, with a stack of firewood neatly arranged next to it. Everything about it seemed normal, nothing unusual at all. I unloaded my bags, set up my things, and spent the first few hours exploring the property. The cabin was nestled in a small valley, surrounded by tall trees. Beyond the immediate area was dense forest, the kind that felt like it had been here forever, untouched and wild. I had no intention of venturing too far in the dark, so I stayed close to the cabin, taking in the beauty of the place. The sunset was stunning, the last rays of light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the ground. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. That night, I cooked a simple dinner, some pasta and salad, and settled into the cabin. It was only me, so the space felt big, almost too big. I could hear the creaking of the wooden beams as I moved around. The wind was picking up outside, making the trees sway and groan. I didn't think much of it, just figured it was the usual sounds of nature. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance and flicker. I had brought a book, but I didn't have much of an appetite for reading. The night was too quiet. There were no animals, no sounds of insects, nothing but the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. At some point, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. It was unsettling, but I told myself that it was just my imagination. I was alone in a cabin in the woods, and the peace should have been comforting, not eerie. By 10 p.m., I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I shut off the lights, took a quick shower, and crawled into bed, hoping sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. The bed was surprisingly uncomfortable, and every little noise from outside seemed louder than it should have been. The wind, the occasional crack of a tree branch, the sounds of the night that should have been normal felt strange. I pulled the blankets up around me and tried to close my eyes. Around 2 a.m., I heard something that made me sit up straight in bed. A faint knocking, almost like someone was tapping on the window. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I got out of bed and stood at the window, but all I could see was the dark outline of the trees swaying in the wind. I convinced myself it was just the wind making branches hit the cabin, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked the locks on the door and the windows before going back to bed, keeping the lights off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The next day, I woke up feeling strange, not rested, but off. I tried to shake it off and make the most of my day. I spent some time hiking the nearby trails, trying to connect with nature, but I couldn't get the nagging feeling out of my head. I kept looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone to be following me. The woods were beautiful, sure, but they felt isolating in a way that was starting to unsettle me. The more I walked, the more I noticed little details that made the place feel wrong. The ground was soft, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The trees were too dense, blocking out the sunlight, making everything feel darker. I didn't like it. The woods felt like they were closing in on me. That night, I lit the fire again and tried to enjoy the evening. But I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder. Every sound outside felt more deliberate. When I went to bed, I checked the windows and doors again, but this time, I locked them with an almost obsessive precision. I lay there for hours just listening, and then it came again, the tapping on the window, soft but distinct. I froze. My pulse raced. I didn't move. I just stared at the window, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But I couldn't. The tapping continued, rhythmic, like someone was tapping with their fingers or something larger, maybe a stick. I slowly got up, my heart pounding in my chest. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. There was nothing, just darkness. The trees swayed, and the wind rustled the leaves. I backed away from the window, but as I turned, I heard it again. This time, it came from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was something else. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I tried to remember if I had heard anything about the area. Stories of locals, anything that could explain what was happening. But nothing came to mind. I thought about leaving, but the road back to town was hours away, and the sun would be down soon. Besides, what if I was just imagining it? The isolation was playing tricks on me. I stayed up the rest of the night, lying awake in bed, listening. Every once in a while, I heard a noise. Another knock, another tap. It was always coming from somewhere else, always distant. I couldn't tell if it was someone out there or just my mind running wild. The wind picked up again, but the sounds kept going. The creaking of the cabin's frame became more pronounced. In the morning, I decided it was time to go. I packed my things quickly, not bothering to eat breakfast. The tapping stopped once the sun rose, but I didn't feel any safer. I locked the door behind me and drove out of the woods, the road feeling longer and more winding than it had the day before. I didn't look back. When I got home, I never really talked about it. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I didn't want to admit how terrified I had been. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, I didn't want to find out again. I hadn't planned on going to the cabin that weekend, but when my buddy Steve called, practically begging me to join him, I thought, why not? A break from the hustle and bustle of city life seemed like exactly what I needed. I packed a bag, threw in a couple of beers, and hit the road. The drive was long, winding through the dense woods as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The further I drove, the less I could see of the modern world. The forest seemed to close in on the road, a never-ending canopy of trees above. The cabin was way out in the middle of nowhere, tucked in a valley that barely had phone signal. I finally arrived as the sky was starting to darken, pulling up to the old cabin. It wasn't much, just a small, weathered wooden structure with a sagging porch. But the place had its charm. There were a couple of chairs set up outside, facing the small lake just beyond the cabin. The water reflected the setting sun, casting a golden glow across everything. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost, considering how far we were from anything. Steve was already there, sitting on the porch with a beer in his hand. He stood up as I got out of the car, grinning wide. "Glad you made it, man," he said, his voice relaxed. "Come on in. It's good to be out here, away from everything." I nodded and grabbed my bag from the trunk. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. It was the kind of scent that instantly reminded me of childhood trips to the woods, where the air always felt cleaner, the world quieter. As I walked toward the cabin, the floorboards creaked under my feet. Steve led the way inside. The cabin had a cozy feel to it, despite its age. The wooden beams of the ceiling were exposed, and the place had a musty scent of old wood mixed with the faint smell of campfire smoke. A few old couches were scattered around the room, and there was a fireplace in the center, surrounded by shelves filled with books and knickknacks that seemed to have been there for years. It felt like a place stuck in time. "We've got everything we need," Steve said, motioning to a small kitchen area with a stove and a counter covered in cups and snacks. "Firewood's already stacked outside, and there's a grill if we want to cook." "Looks good," I said, tossing my bag onto one of the chairs by the window. The view outside was nice, just the lake and trees, nothing else. I could hear the faint rustle of the wind through the leaves, a gentle reminder of how far away we were from civilization. As the evening wore on, we cracked open some beers and started a fire in the pit outside. We joked about life back home, about work, about women, just the usual stuff. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt the quiet weight of the forest around us. It was unnervingly still, the kind of silence you only get when you're far from any sort of human life. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. At some point, Steve got up and went inside to grab more firewood. I was left alone for a few minutes, staring into the flames. The fire crackled and popped, and for a second, I thought I saw something move in the woods, just beyond the tree line. I stood up, squinting into the dark, but all I saw were shadows, the shapes of the trees bending in the wind. I shook my head, laughing at myself. Maybe I was just tired. When Steve came back outside, I was still standing there, trying to shake off that odd feeling. He handed me another beer and we fell back into easy conversation. The night wore on, the fire slowly burning down to embers. By the time we decided to call it a night, the air had cooled significantly, and the stars were bright above us. I was glad to be inside, out of the cold. We both settled into our separate rooms. The cabin only had 2 bedrooms, one for each of us. My room was small but comfortable enough, with a single bed, a dresser, and a small nightstand. I tossed my clothes onto the chair and lay down, staring up at the ceiling. The room was silent, almost too quiet. Even the usual creaks of an old house were absent. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and after a long day of driving and a couple of beers, I felt myself drifting off. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something. A faint scratching sound came from somewhere outside my window. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder. I sat up, straining my ears. It sounded like something was dragging along the ground, moving slowly in a circle around the cabin. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. There was nothing, just the dark forest stretching out in front of me. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. I lay back down, telling myself I was being paranoid. The noise stopped, and eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing. Steve was already up, standing in the kitchen, his back to me. I stretched and yawned, rubbing my eyes. The sun was just rising, casting a pale light through the windows. "You sleep okay?" Steve asked, turning around with a cup of coffee in his hand. His hair was messy, and he looked like he'd been up for a while. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I had. "Just a little weird, you know? The woods at night are different. Too quiet." Steve nodded, his face growing serious. "Yeah, I know what you mean. It gets to you after a while." We ate breakfast together in silence, each lost in our thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something just out of place, but I couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until later in the morning that things started to get weird. We decided to take a walk around the property, just to stretch our legs. The cabin was surrounded by trees, but there was a small trail that led into the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds or rustling leaves were absent, and the air felt thick with tension. As we walked, I noticed something strange. There were no animal tracks, not a single one. No deer, no raccoons, no squirrels. It was like the woods were deserted. We kept walking, following the trail deeper into the trees, but the further we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. I kept turning around, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but each time, the forest remained still. Steve, always the laid-back guy, didn't seem to notice. He was humming some old song as he walked ahead, lost in his own world. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We reached a clearing eventually, a small spot where the trees had thinned out. There was a pile of rocks in the center, and a weathered wooden bench facing a small creek. It was peaceful, but there was an odd energy about it. The whole place felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but my skin crawled. "That's a nice spot," Steve said, sitting down on the bench. He seemed completely at ease, as if nothing was bothering him. But I couldn't relax. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept scanning the woods around us. "Let's head back," I said, my voice tight. "I don't like it out here." Steve raised an eyebrow but stood up. "Sure, man. Whatever you say." We retraced our steps back toward the cabin, but as we neared the trees again, I heard something. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the underbrush. I spun around, but the forest was empty. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. Steve looked at me, confused. "What?" "Footsteps. I swear I heard them." He shook his head. "I don't hear anything. You're just spooked, man. It's all in your head." But as we made our way back to the cabin, the sound of those footsteps lingered in my mind. Something was wrong out here, and I was starting to realize it wasn't just the forest that was strange. It was the cabin, too. We got back to the cabin, and I was ready to pack up and leave. But Steve wasn't having it. He insisted we stay another night, said it was just the woods getting to me. I didn't want to be the paranoid guy, so I agreed. That night, as we sat by the fire again, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The small pile of firewood we had stacked earlier was now scattered all over the ground, as if someone or something had moved it. Steve didn't seem to notice, but I did. That night, I stayed awake, lying in bed with my ears straining for any noise. I could hear the soft creaking of the cabin, but nothing else. The wind had picked up, and it seemed like the trees were whispering outside. I kept my eyes closed, but I knew something was wrong. Something was out there, and it wasn't just in my head. When morning finally came, I didn't feel any better. If anything, the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. We packed up and left, heading back down the long, winding road. By the time we hit the main highway again, I felt like I could breathe again. The air felt lighter, the tension finally lifting. I never went back to that cabin. It was late October when I decided to take a trip up to the old cabin my uncle had left me in his will. The place was tucked away in the mountains, far from the nearest town, which made it the perfect spot to get away from the chaos of daily life. I'd never been up there before. My uncle had always talked about it, but I'd never had the chance to visit. He passed away a few months ago, and now the cabin was mine. I was 28 years old, working a regular job in the city, and honestly, I needed some time to clear my head. I didn't know much about the cabin, only that it was isolated and that my uncle had built it himself. It had been years since anyone had stayed there, and the idea of spending a weekend by myself in such a secluded spot both excited and unnerved me. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads grew narrower as I got further into the mountains. There were no streetlights, and the dense trees on either side made it feel like I was driving into the heart of nowhere. I had my GPS, but it seemed to lose signal every few miles. The last stretch of road was a dirt path, bumpy and uneven, and by the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. The cabin was just as my uncle had described it. A small, two-story building made of weathered wood with a wraparound porch. It looked like it had been there for decades. The roof had a few patches where the shingles had come loose, and the wooden railing of the porch had splintered in places. Still, it had a charm about it. The kind of place you could imagine yourself escaping to when you needed to forget about the world. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way inside. The door creaked when I opened it, but the lock worked fine. The inside of the cabin was simple but cozy. A small living room with an old couch, a fireplace, a table with a few mismatched chairs, and a small kitchen off to the side. It smelled a little musty, like old wood and dust, but nothing unbearable. There was a staircase leading up to the second floor, and I assumed there were a couple of bedrooms up there. After I unpacked, I started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth was a relief against the chill of the evening air, and soon the room felt much more inviting. I had some canned food with me, and after dinner, I sat down by the fire with a book, feeling the weight of the silence around me. It wasn't until around midnight that I started to feel uneasy. I was sitting in the living room, the fire crackling in front of me, when I thought I heard something, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, like a tapping, coming from the direction of the kitchen. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. The old wood creaked and groaned all the time, especially when it was cold outside. But then I heard it again, this time louder. It was a rhythmic sound, like something tapping on the wall. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just being paranoid. There was no one out here but me. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen any other cars on the road. But the tapping continued, and the more I listened, the more it sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, my feet echoing on the wooden floor. The sound stopped as soon as I reached the doorway. I flicked the light on, but everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. No one was there. The walls were solid. I spent the rest of the night with my back to the fire, listening for any other sounds. But nothing else happened. The night stretched on quietly, and I eventually fell asleep, although I didn't sleep well. The tapping lingered in my mind, making it hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I decided to explore the cabin and its surroundings. The weather was clear, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over everything. There was a small trail behind the cabin that led up into the woods, so I decided to follow it, hoping the fresh air and the quiet would help clear my mind. As I walked, I noticed the landscape had a certain stillness to it. The trees were thick and towering, and there was no sign of any animals, not even birds. It was strange. In fact, the silence seemed almost unnatural. After about an hour, the trail began to narrow, and the trees grew denser. The further I went, the more I began to feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the shadows. I eventually reached a small clearing. It was peaceful, too peaceful, and I stopped to take a deep breath. That's when I noticed something odd. A small shack, hidden away among the trees. It was barely visible from the trail, its dark wooden walls blending into the surrounding forest. The shack was run down, its roof caving in, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. I approached it cautiously, unsure why I felt so drawn to it. The door was cracked open, just slightly, as if someone had been in there recently. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open, and the door creaked as it moved. Inside, the shack was dark, the air thick with dust and mildew. There was nothing of real value, just old furniture covered in sheets, a few broken bottles, and scattered remnants of a life long gone. But what caught my eye was a small wooden box in the corner. It was old, with intricate carvings on its surface. Something about it seemed important. I knelt down and opened it carefully. Inside were a few scraps of paper, but one of them caught my attention. It was a map, drawn with shaky handwriting, marking the location of the cabin I was staying in. The map didn't make any sense. It seemed to show a different layout of the cabin, one that included a hidden room beneath the floorboards. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized the implications. My uncle had never mentioned any hidden rooms. I had to go back and check. I returned to the cabin as quickly as I could, my mind racing. I had to know if the map was real, if there was something hidden in the cabin that I hadn't found yet. Once inside, I immediately started looking around the living room, then the kitchen. I checked the walls, the floor, everything. Eventually, I found it. There was a loose plank near the back of the living room. I pried it open with my hands, heart pounding, and discovered a small, dark space underneath. I crawled down, my fingers brushing against the damp, cold floor beneath me. It was tight, but there was something down there. What I found made my blood run cold. In the corner of the small hidden room was a journal. I recognized it immediately. It was my uncle's handwriting. The pages were filled with strange drawings and notes, detailing odd occurrences he had experienced while living in the cabin. But the more I read, the more it became clear that something had driven him to madness. He had written about hearing things, tapping sounds, whispers in the walls, the feeling of being watched. The entries grew more frantic as time went on, with my uncle detailing his obsession with a presence that he couldn't explain. It was then that I realized the tapping I had heard the night before hadn't been my imagination. Whatever had affected my uncle was still there. It had never left the cabin. I suddenly felt a sense of urgency. I needed to leave now. I packed my things in a hurry, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes into my bag. But before I could leave, I heard it again. The tapping, faint but distinct, echoing through the walls. My heart raced, and I bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the car. I didn't look back. I drove through the night, my mind still reeling from what I had found. When I finally reached the nearest town, I called a friend, explaining what had happened. He told me I was being paranoid, that I should go back and check it out in the daylight, but I couldn't. I knew I had to leave it behind. To this day, I've never returned to that cabin. I don't know what my uncle found or what he uncovered, but something in that place had driven him to the edge. I don't ever plan to go back. Some things are better left untouched, and I'm convinced that whatever he experienced is still there, waiting for the next person to listen to its calls. It was a last-minute decision, the kind you make when everything in your life feels like it's slipping away and you need something, anything, to break the monotony. I hadn't been out of the city in years, so when I found that little cabin in the mountains, it felt like the perfect escape. I didn't think much about the location or the fact that it was in the middle of nowhere. All I cared about was the peace and quiet. I booked the cabin for a weekend in early September. The weather had been unseasonably warm, so I packed light, not bothering with much more than a few clothes, my camera, and a good book. The cabin's listing had claimed it was remote, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors for miles. That sounded ideal to me. The more isolated, the better. The drive was longer than I had anticipated. The GPS kept rerouting me, sending me down winding, unpaved roads that seemed to disappear into the thick trees. I had to stop several times just to get my bearings. The place wasn't even marked on a map. I had just a vague description and some coordinates that seemed a little too off the beaten path for comfort. When I finally arrived, it was already dusk. The cabin was exactly how the photos had described it. Small, weathered wood, and just enough space for one person to get lost in their own thoughts. It was tucked into a valley, surrounded by towering pines and thick foliage. There was no porch, just a set of stairs leading up to a plain wooden door. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The interior was surprisingly cozy. A small living area with an old leather couch, a wood-burning stove, and a shelf filled with books I figured hadn't been touched in years. The windows were covered with thick curtains, casting everything in a dusky, dim light. The smell of aged wood and dust mixed with the fresh, pine-scented air coming through the cracks in the walls. I made a mental note to open the windows in the morning. I set my things down and decided to take a quick walk before the sun disappeared entirely. The air was cool, and the rustling leaves had a strange kind of peace about them, a peace that felt almost too still. The forest surrounding the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. As I walked farther into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I shook it off. The trees made strange creaking noises in the wind, and I figured it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me. By the time I made my way back to the cabin, the sky was dark. I cooked a quick dinner, unpacked, and sat down by the stove to read. There was no TV, no internet, nothing but the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind. I had no plans for the next day. Maybe I'd explore more, or maybe just enjoy the solitude. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises from outside, footsteps, perhaps, or the snapping of branches. But every time I'd listen more closely, it would stop. It was probably just animals, I told myself. The kind of things you only notice when you're alone. I pulled the blankets tighter around me and tried to fall asleep. Around 2 a.m., I was awoken by the unmistakable sound of knocking. It was slow at first, like someone was tapping on the walls of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to ignore it, but then it came again. Louder, faster, almost rhythmic. I got up, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and stood in front of the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Just animals, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. I grabbed my phone to call someone, but of course, there was no service. The only thing left was the flashlight on my phone, which did little to illuminate the surroundings when I stepped outside. I hesitated, scanning the area around the cabin. The trees stood still in the night, shadows that moved with the wind. My stomach churned as I realized just how dark it had become. Even the moonlight seemed muffled by the thick canopy of trees above. I stepped forward, flashlight trembling in my hand, pointing it at the ground, trying to catch any sign of movement. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something strange. A set of broken branches near the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, too fresh, as if someone had been there not long ago. My pulse quickened. I knew I hadn't walked this way when I arrived earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, so I hurried back into the cabin and locked the door. The knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking itself. It was like the whole forest had fallen completely still. Hours passed, and I didn't sleep a wink. The knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, but I couldn't bring myself to check again. What was I supposed to do? There was nowhere to go. The isolation was part of the reason I'd come out here in the first place, but now it felt suffocating, like a trap. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cold morning air. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Everything seemed normal, as though the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. I spent the morning cleaning up around the cabin, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. I didn't feel safe here anymore, but I didn't know where I could go. There was no one around for miles. I considered packing up and leaving early, but a part of me wanted to stay, to prove that I could handle whatever was out there. By midday, the noises started again. The same slow knocking, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging against the ground. I froze, the blood draining from my face. This time, it wasn't just the knocking. I could hear footsteps, dragging footsteps, coming closer to the cabin. I grabbed my camera, thinking it was some kind of prank or a hunter messing around. I wasn't even sure if I believed in it myself, but my instincts were screaming at me to get the hell out. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered out. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It was too far for me to make out any details, but the shape of it was unmistakable. A man, maybe. He was tall, his body obscured by the shadows of the trees. I couldn't see his face, but his presence felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay, but I wasn't sure if I was safe driving back down the mountain either. The figure moved, slowly, toward the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I ran to the door and locked it again. The sound of dragging feet got closer, then stopped. Silence. I waited, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Eventually, the silence became too much to bear. I grabbed my things, packed as quickly as I could, and ran outside, not even stopping to close the door behind me. I don't know what happened after that, whether I was just paranoid, or if there had truly been someone out there. I never found out. But I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back on the main road, and the forest was far behind me. The cabin, with all its unsettling quiet and hidden dangers, was nothing more than a memory. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone about what happened. It was hard to explain, harder still to admit I had let myself get so caught up in something I couldn't control. A week later, I received an email from the cabin's owner. It was a simple message, one that made my blood run cold. I hope your stay was peaceful. Just so you know, the cabin was built over the remains of an old logging camp. Some of the workers used to wander off into the woods. They never came back. I never went back to that cabin, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods or at the edge of a clearing, I still hear the sound of dragging feet in the distance. The cabin stood alone, tucked away in the trees just beyond the mountains. The nearest town was over an hour's drive away, and the path leading to it wasn't marked on any map. The only way to reach it was by winding down narrow dirt roads, hidden beneath layers of fallen pine needles. The cabin, weathered by years of harsh winters and hot summers, looked like it could have been built a century ago. Despite its old exterior, there was something undeniably inviting about it. Maybe it was the scent of pine trees and fresh earth, or maybe it was the simple promise of solitude that I was desperately craving. I had decided to spend the weekend alone, away from the noise of city life, far from the bustle of constant phone calls and obligations. My name is Ben, and I was 28 years old when I drove up here. I'd taken the time off from my work as a graphic designer, wanting a chance to reset. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect place. A break from everything. No distractions, no one to talk to. Just me, nature, and my thoughts. The first few hours of the drive were peaceful. The air was cool and fresh, the kind of crispness that only comes in the fall. The trees around me were just beginning to change color, splashing the landscape with rich oranges, yellows, and reds. I could feel the tension from my busy life begin to melt away as I drove deeper into the forest, leaving behind the noise and chaos of the outside world. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I parked my car in front of the cabin, the tires crunching over gravel and dirt. The air smelled of damp wood, pine, and something earthy. Everything was still. No wind, no birds chirping, just the sound of my own breath and the distant murmur of a stream somewhere far beyond the trees. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and walked up to the front porch. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, cozy living room. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a small kitchen to the side, and a loft above where I could see a bed waiting for me. The cabin had everything I needed: a couch, a small table, and even a stack of firewood beside the hearth. The decor was rustic, with wooden beams overhead and a few old but sturdy furniture pieces scattered around. Inside, it was warm despite the cool air outside. I dropped my bags by the door and went straight to the kitchen, where I made a simple meal for myself. As I ate, I noticed how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making everything feel heavier. It was nice, but at the same time it felt strange, like something was just off. That night, after I had finished eating, I settled down on the couch with a book. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a flickering glow across the room. The shadows danced along the walls, making the cabin feel alive in a way. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping into the back of my mind. The silence had become oppressive. Every so often, I thought I heard something. A branch snapping outside, a rustle in the leaves, or the faintest sound that I couldn't quite place. But I shrugged it off. It was probably just animals in the woods. I was in the middle of nowhere, after all. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The bed in the loft was comfortable, and the thick blankets helped keep the chill at bay. I lay there in the dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear it howling through the trees. It was the kind of wind that makes the trees creak and groan, like they're alive. Couldn't sleep. The wind and the silence worked together to keep me awake, stirring the air in the cabin and making the shadows shift in unsettling ways. I tossed and turned, finally getting up to stoke the fire. When I reached the stairs to the loft, I stopped. There was something strange about the sound. It was faint, but I could swear I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, coming from the floor below. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. Someone or something was downstairs. I wasn't sure if I wanted to investigate, but the curiosity gnawed at me. Slowly, I descended the stairs, careful not to make a sound. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I peered into the dark living room. There was nothing, just the low glow of the fireplace, casting long shadows across the floor. No one was there. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It must have been the wind. It had to have been. But then, I noticed something. The front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I came in, but now it was open, just a crack. I froze, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. The air felt colder now, like something had shifted. I slowly walked over to the door and pushed it closed, locking the bolt. I didn't know why, but I felt safer once it was shut. But that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. There was something I couldn't put my finger on. Something wasn't right. The silence had turned oppressive again, and my mind kept replaying the strange footsteps I had heard. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. The fire burned low, and the wind outside only grew stronger. But nothing else happened. It was just the stillness and the darkness, pressing in on me from all sides. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself out of bed. The sun had risen, and the sky was a pale blue, clear and cloudless. I needed to get out of the cabin to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, breathing in the fresh mountain air. The sun felt warm on my face, and I was grateful for the escape from the stuffiness inside the cabin. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, taking in the view of the woods. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of anyone having been near the place. No footprints or strange markings, just trees, rocks, and a steady stream running nearby. But the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the day hiking around the area, trying to push the strange events from my mind. The sound of footsteps, the open door, the unsettling quiet. It was all too much. By evening, I was ready to leave. I didn't care if it was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. I just wanted to get out of there. The cabin felt too close, too suffocating, like it was waiting for me to do something wrong. As I packed my things and prepared to leave, I heard something, a faint noise coming from upstairs. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my things, not caring if I forgot something, and rushed out of the cabin. I locked the door behind me and threw my bags into the back of my car. I didn't look back as I drove away. The trees seemed to loom taller and the shadows longer, but I was relieved. The drive back was uneventful, and as I entered the town, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The tension that had gripped me in that cabin, that sense of something watching, had finally faded. When I arrived back in the city, I didn't think about it much. I moved on, back to the grind of my everyday life. The cabin was nothing but a memory. But there was one thing that stayed with me. I never did figure out who or what had been in that cabin. I'd like to think it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I know that something was there, and whatever it was waiting for me to leave.